Okay, everybody, we have reached the bottom of the hour, so let's get going with today's LTEN webinar, Personalized Learning Can and Will Improve Salesforce Effectiveness, sponsored by ClearPoint Learning. My name is Tim Sosby. I'm Editorial Director for LTEN. It's my pleasure to welcome you and to serve as the host of today's program. I'm going to start by showing you a few housekeeping items here, including how you can submit questions to our speakers today. We are planning a 60-minute session for you. Today we're going to try to hold it that hour, maybe give you a little more time back at the end, but certainly try not to go over that time. As you might have noticed, your phones are on mute, so if you have any questions, I would ask you to submit those using the Q&A feature, the questions module, control panel there on the right side of your screen. I would urge you to submit any questions or comments you have throughout the program along the way while they're fresh in your mind. We will have a Q&A toward the end of the hour, but we'll also take questions throughout as needed as well. So if a question occurs to you, please do send it in while it's fresh in your mind. I also wanted to point out on that control panel there's a handouts button. You can download a few handouts associated with today's webinar, including a copy of the PDF copy of the webinar presentation slides. There's also a couple of documents in there from LTEN that you might be interested in, one talking about our upcoming conference this June, which I hope you'll all join us for, and then also one talking about our certificate program. So certainly feel free to use the download box. You can just highlight the titles that you want, hit the download button, and it will download to your desktop, and you can manage the file from there. I also want to tell you today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived for future reference to the L-10.org website. We're also going to send you an email about 1 hour after today's webinar with a link to that recording. So certainly look for that. And speaking of looking for things, as you leave today's webinar, a short follow-up survey is going to pop up on a separate browser window. Please do take a moment after the webinar, find that survey, and share your thoughts with us. You can also find that survey through the email that we send you an hour after today's program. So one way or the other, please do find that survey and let us know what you think of today's program. We do these for you, so of course your feedback is very important. And along those lines, my email address is right here at the bottom of the screen. If I can help you with anything before, during, or after one of our webinars, certainly don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, with all of that said, let me introduce you to our speakers today. You're going to be hearing from Kent Malmros and Carl Kopp. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Kent Malmros is the Vice President of Global Strategy and Product for ClearPoint Learning. Kent joined ClearPoint in April of 2014, initially serving as ClearPoint's VP of Product and Alliances. In this role, Kent was responsible for managing existing partnerships and implementing a global product strategy. In addition to building ClearPoint's product strategy, he was chartered with initiating development efforts on key offerings. He has also built a product management and services organization to support commercial implementation of these offerings. Dr. Carl Kopp is a professional in the field of learning and e-learning with a focus on interactive learning, games, and gamification. Carl is an instructional technology graduate professor at Bloomsburg University in Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. And he's a consultant, co-founder of a startup, speaker, book author, scholar, coach, and researcher on the convergence of learning, technology, and business operations, focused in the areas of games and gamification. Carl's books include The Gamification of Learning and Instruction and Gadgets, Games, and Gizmos for Learning. I know you're going to enjoy learning from both Kent and Carl today, so I'm going to turn things over to Kent to get us started. Kent, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. We really appreciate you having us. Excited to kick off another year partnering with LTEN on some of these webinars. We had a great year together last year, and very excited to have Dr. Carl Kopp joining us. Those of you that have heard us talk about some of our approaches to measurement and analytics know that we work with Carl, so appreciate you being here, Dr. Kopp. Thank you so much.
Great to be here, Kent, and excited to be here, and especially talking about this very interesting topic.
Excellent. And one more housekeeping item, Tim. I agree, we want to get as many questions as possible using the GoToWebinar feature. In addition, we've opened another channel for conversation that we're hoping you can use even after the webinar ends. Using Twitter, we have hashtag LTENLearning. So anything that you want to discuss on an ongoing basis, we'll be monitoring it. We can have a dialogue that way as well. So let's jump in. The topic of this webinar is about personalization of learning and how it can impact trainers, sales reps, and essentially make you a better overall commercial organization. And our belief, and you've heard us talk a lot about measurement and analytics, is that it starts there. And so some of the slides, for those of you that have joined us before, first of all, thank you, that you're going to see in the next, may look a bit familiar, but the key is really about how some of these concepts have translated into a personalization theme. So when we dove into really trying to help answer the questions about how to improve measurement analytics in training programs, the aspiration that we at ClearPoint had, and I think that everyone in industry has, are to try to connect training and training outcomes with performance in the field. It's a great ambition, but we've really seen that there's a number of steps that need to be taken, and there are interim milestones and interim victories that can also have a really important impact on how we're delivering training, and specifically linking measurement and making measurement matter to a personalization approach. This quote by Sidney Harris is exceptionally appropriate in that case. So when we think of the purpose of educating, turning mirrors into windows, I think it really reflects where we have been overall with training measurement, and it's been much more of a mirror-based approach. So if we think, again, about how we've done training measurement over the last few decades, there's a number of themes that really pop up, and the first slide talks a little bit about how we see those learning outcomes and the evolution. Attendance at a particular instructor-led training event still very predominant, right? Instructor-led training is critical, so we get paper-based completions. Then the emergence of a learning management system is getting us electronic completions, and we're able to track data, ideally see it a little bit differently than an electronic scenario. And then you may evolve to activity and potentially question-level outcomes with strong question-answer tools that eventually lead to some correlations. Maybe you're able to tag questions to things like competencies. But that's the level of data we've been getting. And if we take a minute and think about what personalized learning is, for example, it's the idea that you can take some learning objectives, build content that is specifically training against those learning objectives, something I think everyone that is in this webinar has some expertise doing, and a lot of experience for sure. And then delivery and measurement. So there is no personalization without measurement, and the measurement that relates back to what those intended objectives and outcomes are. And so we think about how we capture that data. It's also important to look at what the data is, and if that gives us the ability to create the right level of personalization to appropriately impact the learner to become better in the ways that we want. So if you think about pass-fail data, really it's telling you that you've completed something where a learning objective that might be rich and robust and have an intent to change behavior has content structure around it. But, and we'll dive into this, Carl, you will certainly a little bit more, we're typically measuring on a pass-fail basis comprehension, and that's not necessarily enough. Status, whether or not someone's actually completed something or is overdue, is certainly not getting to those objectives. Compliance and role adherence are just a way to structure or maybe align those objectives, and we can see that, but it's not getting to that level of personalization. And Carl, I'd say in your experience, you've seen all those things still to be the level of data that's required out in the field, correct?
Right, yeah, that's still we don't call it butts and seats anymore, and we're trying to move in more forward of a direction, but a lot of the measurements that we default to come back to how many people have completed training over what period of time, and not necessarily what is the behavioral impact that we're receiving.
Right. And I think it's critical, even as we look at that challenge, not to overlook that personalized learning has absolutely evolved. And we've seen this here, certainly at ClearPoint, and many of us in the field. I think the first attempt is really branching, and often this happened within an e-learning module, potentially self-contained, and you might take the idea of aligning measured knowledge outcomes with something like a pretest that turned on and off topics within that e-learning module to allow for personalization of an asynchronous learning experience. So instead of maybe a 35-minute, 32-slide module, all of a sudden we were building, and this is a challenge which we'll talk about a bit, very fat assets that were SCORM packages with maybe 100 slides where you would turn on and off 20, 30, 40 of them to personalize the journey. It was a step in the right direction, but still based on comprehension, not measuring what people were doing with the knowledge that you'd structured. Role-based training very much the same way, so maybe a pretest to opt in or out of role-based areas or knowledge areas that you've acquired in a previous job. So maybe you're coming into a new company, not a real good way to baseline individuals, but it is a personalization of that learning journey based on some initial comprehension measurement. I think, of course, the one that we always talk about is adaptive learning. It's been, I think, in many ways a little bit, I wouldn't say controversial, but there's quite a dichotomy about success versus failure in adaptive technologies. Certainly, the idea that you can combine the concepts above of having learning objectives, tagging them to content, having an automated workflow whereby someone tests in or out of topics and the curriculum is on the fly revised to meet their personal needs is a great aspiration. It's been met in many respects in higher ed or K-12 where some adaptive technologies have had success, not as much in corporate learning. And Carl and I have talked a little bit about this. I've talked about it with a number of other colleagues as well. A lot of the reason for that, a K-12 or a higher ed curriculum is not dynamic. It's very static. And the burden is not necessarily about impacting behaviors. It's about showing that you've met the criteria to complete a course and reach a certain level and have a certificate or a degree. In commercial sales training for life sciences, it's fair to say everything we're doing is dynamic. So every time a company is looking to train a sales force on a new product, a new molecule, there's a new disease state, it's a new content area. How that content area needs to be used to both effectively train people out in the industry, HCPs, ensure that you're dealing with certain types of knowledge and leveraging it in a way that actually helps the customer, the patient, without having a compliance challenge. It's critical and it changes. And so the burden that we see in terms of trying to get to that promise of adaptive learning in the corporate space, and particularly in life sciences, is so much higher. So technology may be there, it may be adapted, no pun intended, towards what we're trying to do in commercial sales training for life sciences, but they might have to be customized or maybe high overhead. Because that content is so dynamic, it takes a long time potentially to tag something the right way to get that branched workflow to personalize a training path. And you're still trying to measure the same way, and it's a moving target, right? So which knowledge do we have to actually look at? Which do we have to measure? And so the intersection of those in setup becomes an incredibly heavy lift for what may be a very short window, 3 to 6 months, where you know that you're getting some level of approval on the new product in a launch scenario and trying to translate that into an adaptive system. Carl, I know you feel that dynamic versus static content is probably one of the biggest barriers we've seen in getting adapted into a corporate setting.
It really is. Adaptive is, in some ways the holy grail of online learning, and lots of organizations have tried it and had various degrees of success. But companies like Dreambox, which works with mathematical content, for example, for younger students, can do that really well. They can devise whether or not you have the basic math skills by how you answer an algebra question. But that's really hard in a dynamic corporate environment to say, well, how well does someone know the mechanism of action if we ask, a question related to the application of it in talking to a physician? Well, it may be that they don't understand the sales model or they don't understand mechanism. We're not quite sure what that would be. And so that's a huge burden to try to parse all of that and then feed that to the learner, have the learner break it apart, and then answer those specific questions, and then kind of the system say, oh, well, Carl knew the mechanisms of action, but he didn't know the sales model, so now we have to address sales model. It becomes very expensive and time-consuming to try to do those types of efforts, as you said, as the competitive landscape changes, as FDA, issues new rules and regulations or new letters, as even the sales model changes, so it becomes really difficult to do that. And anything, as you get more adaptive or more personalized, it can also lead to more expense, and then we're constantly trying to weigh off the expense of implementing something like that versus the payoff.
Exactly.
And we can do that in, as you said, in college and in K through 12 because it doesn't change, and we can use it year after year after year, but not necessarily in a corporate setting.
Yeah, thanks, Carl. So, Tim, I think it's time to maybe turn it over, go one slide back, to you. I'd love to have some audience interaction and take a poll. think everyone here has probably thought about, contemplated, or tried to implement some level of personalized learning into a training program. Curious what the challenge is and all that would apply they've seen in actually accomplishing that. So defining clear learning objectives is one, role alignment to content, the time it actually takes to tag the content, no real technology solutions applicable to the corporate training needs, and potentially the time and cost to implement. So I see, Tim, you brought the poll up.
I did. Thank you very much. And folks, you can go ahead and make your choices here. Again, this is an all that apply. So if you can select whatever the biggest barriers that affect you in terms of personalized learning. And Kent and Carl, I can tell you that people are voting very quickly right now.
Awesome. And Carl, I think it's safe to say there's probably more than this. When we put 5 different factors down, these are some of the ones that first came to mind, but we've seen others, correct?
There's been, yeah, lots of others. In fact, one of the issues is, tying them back to, we'll talk about this later, behavioral measurements. One of them is trying to break down what your personal learning objectives need to be. Sometimes you run into the situation, you run into this with competencies sometimes, is that you spend so much time breaking down competencies that sometimes they seem familiar. Oh, everybody has to have communication. Well, what does communication mean? And you break that down, you spend so much time breaking it down that it's hard to then monitor and maintain the measurements. It just becomes unwieldy.
Exactly. Tim, how are the answers looking right now? Do we have enough data to show and discuss?
We sure do, everybody. Thanks so much for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll at this point. And Kent, here you go.
Man, look at that balance. Time and cost to implement, so that certainly supports the hypothesis that we spoke to earlier. I don't think anything really jumps out as a surprise here for me, Carl. How about you?
No, I think it's, I guess, good. Misery loves company, right? But all these seem to be struggles, and I think we'll talk about this today. I think one of this is a reaction to trying to over-engineer a solution that might not have the cost benefit over time. But these are real. There's not a whole lot of tech out there that you can just plug things into, and then when you try to align things together. So yeah, I think this is a pretty accurate reflection of what I've seen in the field.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Perfect time to go back to the slide. And I think instead of talking about what the challenges have been, we're definitely here to try to provide some insight as to the solutions that we've seen. And I think as we talk about not necessarily having the best tech solutions, technology is absolutely part of the solution. We have to be able to deliver learning. We have to be able to measure. So there's a need to acquire data. But really, I think the key that we want to jump into is thinking through exactly what we mean by there's an aspiration, but there are interim tools that we have, approaches, methodologies that we can implement to really bring this down to some of the basics, plus an evolved consideration of how we acquire training data and what we do with it. So that's where we're going to go now, which is, hey, here's an approach where measurement can equal personalization in a real-world way with some rapid capabilities to intervene. But it starts with data, and this is a great quote by Chip and Dan Heath, two of my favorite business authors. Data are just summaries of thousands of stories. Tell a few of those stories to help make the data meaningful. And really, we're going back to some of the challenges we believe we've seen in training measurement, which is big data provides thousands of stories. Training data, corporate training data, traditionally has not. And so one of the discussions we have quite often with customers, with peers in industry, is the first challenge in training data is to move past those very few, very thin layers of completions and potentially assessment scores, though those are often really not that valuable because learners have 5 or 6 attempts potentially to get to 80% proficiency. That's not a rich data set telling thousands of stories. It doesn't help you hone in on the problem. So we really believe that the first way to lead to personalization through a training journey is to move beyond that, to start measuring other things. And what do we mean? The training completions are not really an indicator of meeting an objective. We structure objectives very elegantly. We write things around an objective, and off the top of my head, for example, the objective of this topic is to ensure that a learner understands the indicators for compliance challenges within a certain state. the fact that they're able to cram within a 35-minute e-learning module or an ebook, retain a fact, and test out in a multiple choice question isn't an indicator that they've met that objective. They can apply the knowledge beyond a comprehension level. We understand that there's a need to know the knowledge, but the key, of course, is you want to get beyond moving through pre-planned and pre-prescribed learning so that it become personalized if that objective is not actually being met. And the first way to do that, of course, is to get past knowledge. Carl's going to talk about that quite a bit in a few minutes. So the idea that training programs don't generate enough of the right data leads us to what else do we need to actually measure? And this is something that we've talked about quite a bit. It's our belief that behavioral data needs to be collected. The training is only generating a few stories, and that we want to be able to generate more stories to hone in on exactly the right one. The first challenge, of course, is to make sure that we can dictate and create more of those indicators so that we can look at them at a very granular level, and then on a personalized basis, find the outliers, think about which ones need some level of intervention. This is really about that being a story. And we use this tool, what we call our analytics maturity model, as a diagnostic. And it's the idea that we talk about that measurement, and of course, so many people, if you look at the cursor on the screen, we're talking about getting to that predictive state, right? So knowing that a particular outcome can lead us to a place, can lead us to diagnosing very specific objectives, very specific learning paths, and getting more efficiency out of the training program. But this has to build. And so when you think about the idea of collecting, are we collecting the right things? Are we then managing it? Are we contextualizing the data, behavioral data potentially, within the journey in a way that lets us quickly make changes? And so some of those thoughts in the previous 3 slides are the things that, frankly, we at ClearPoint approached Dr. Carl Kopp with and said, hey, there's a need out in the industry. We don't believe that knowledge comprehension is enough and that the measurements that are typically being done will ever get us to that predictive state. More importantly, in the journey that we have now gone through over the last 12 to 18 months and beginning to implement very sophisticated measurement programs, we're seeing it hasn't even been enough in helping to create this quick personalization capability. So Carl, when we started to work together, that was the hypothesis, that there had to be more and there had to be other things that we could measure to create diagnostic tools for trainers in the industry.
Right, exactly. So we were fortunate enough to actually have a set of data to look at. So we had a POA meeting and we took the scores from the tests and we ran statistical analysis to find out if there was any predictive ability of any of the scores. Like if you had the 99 out of 100, were you a better salesperson than if you had 80 or if you had 85? Turns out, no, there's not enough spread between 80 and 100 to distinguish enough to make any predictive. So we said there must be something else, right? We all know intuitively, so now we know statistically that just knowing something's not enough to make you a person. So then we said, well, what other elements are there that make good salespeople? So I took a look at the literature to see what was out there and found a number of items in the literature that tied back to what makes salespeople successful. And then we wanted to take a look at that and see, can we really break that down into something that's meaningful as we take a look at the behaviors of salespeople? Are there some behaviors that we can say, wow, if a salesperson does this behavior, then they're going to have this level of success? And my thought was from the book, The Moneyball. So my idea was, what's the equivalent in a sales situation of the on-base percentage, right? So once they found out that on-base percentage was the best predictor of a player's likelihood of scoring and winning in the game, then they went after players who could do that. So I thought, well, if we could predict which salespeople have that skill set, then we could really make a difference. It turns out, and it hasn't never been done before. It turns out it's not been done before because it's really hard to do. And it's really difficult. So we took a step back and said, okay, well, are there things that we can do to get to that point? Are there things we can do to add value between now and then? So we knew that retention was important, but the other thing that happens with retention in this situation is that the sales reps, they learn the content, they cram the content, they take the test, and you've got it. But we all know, we've all crammed for tests. We know the next week, the next 2 weeks, we don't really remember that information. So there's a problem there with knowledge retention and comprehension, and we know that's not predictor of success. And if we know we want to change behaviors, let's look at behaviors, and let's look at the type of behaviors that seems to make sense. So let's take a look at that. So we'll go to the, whoops, I hit the thing too many times. So the importance of behavioral measurement became very clear. We had to accurately measure the behaviors we wanted of the sales reps, or measure behaviors that we thought would contribute to successful sales reps. So it's really difficult, as many of you know, in this particular space to link a specific behavior to specific product market share, or sometimes we can't even prescribe certain behaviors because legal and regulatory say, that's probably not a good idea. So are there behaviors, not specifically that we want the person to do maybe in a meeting with the physician, but are there behaviors that they can do before that we can say, yes, this is what helps make a successful rep. So we want to move beyond knowledge, beyond retention. We wanted to make sure that we can maximize the dollars spent in that. We actually came up with 3 key areas, and I'm sure that they will grow to more areas. But right now we wanted to look at, could we behaviorally define the confidence of a rep? So people always say, well, one of the differences between a rep who's average and a rep who's really hitting home runs is that that rep has a lot of confidence. Well, that's great, but what do you mean by confidence? What behaviors do they do that is exhibited as confidence? And not things like, they have a firm handshake or they look you in the eye. We wanted to say, well, there are things that they did pre-call that indicated that they were confident. Are there elements that they could report on that they're confident in a particular content area, or competent learning about competitors, or that kind of thing? So we broke those down to very defined behavioral measures. Same thing with engagement. What does it really mean? People say, well, sales reps need to be engaged, but what does that mean, engaged? Does that mean they actively talk about the product with colleagues? Does that mean they fill out CRM systems? What exactly does engagement mean? So we define that. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that we didn't try to define everything in the world that would lead to confidence, or everything in the world that would lead to engagement. We said one of the problems with measurement sometimes is we try to measure everything, and then it takes too long, and then we get nothing. So are there key measures that we can identify that say, yes, this indicates confidence, this indicates engagement? We also looked at knowledge and said, most of the knowledge that's being asked of sales reps in the assessments is knowledge related to comprehension. But how about knowledge related to synthesis? Can we craft questions that ask about knowledge, confidence, and engagement all at once? Try to get to all 3 of those. So that was kind of the challenge that we were working on, to see if we could first behaviorally define what we thought were the really key items, and second, assess over time, but whether or not they got that. And so we've developed a number of, and there's nothing brand new here, but we implemented a number of tools that made sense. So one is the rubric. So a rubric basically says, if you're going to put together a sales plan or a sales strategy for, hospital or healthcare or whatever it has to be, how do we objectively measure whether or not that's a good sales plan? How do we know that? So what we did is look at parameters around that, and we say, okay, well, here, for example, is the first thing that you have to do. You have to, properly identify everyone in the organization. Okay, now the second thing you have to do is create a relationship with the key people and that kind of stuff. So that's a rubric. And a properly devised rubric allows you to score objectively. Then you have a checklist. The main difference between a checklist and a rubric is a checklist is kind of a binary thing. Did you do this? Yes. Did you do this? Yes. So the checklist is really good for looking at behaviors. You know, does a successful sales rep do the following? You know, do they take notes in the CRM system? Do they write pre-call objectives? Do they, you know, whatever it happens to be, you can do the checklist. Then we also wanted to get some self-reporting from the sales reps to find out kind of how they felt in terms of confidence. And then the key here was to triangulate it. So don't just rely on one piece of data, the survey, for example, or the checklist or the rubric, but look at how all three of those pieces of data fit and tell the story. So it's one thing to say, yeah, I'm confident on the survey. It's another thing to maybe not do a behavior that we deemed as a confident behavior. So maybe they're not as confident as they say they are, or perhaps they're overconfident in self-reporting. So triangulate the data and, of course, assessments so we know the knowledge and we know what is happening. So the methodology that started to take shape was first to define the objectives that needed to be looked at from a learning perspective, from a confidence, and from the engagement perspective. And we mapped behaviors that we thought would make the most sense. And we broke those down. There are some universal behaviors or some behaviors that are specific to an organization. It just depends. And then deploying the measurement tools. And how we came to think of it was that if you think of a process, statistical process control, a process is in control, and then you can plot across time whether or not the process is leaking out of control, either upwardly or downwardly, and you can look at outliers. And so we thought, well, is there a way that we could look, because everybody says, oh, there's this one sales rep, she is awesome, she never goes into the CRM system, ever, and she never fills out pre-call planning, and she just selling like crazy. Well, is that an anomaly, or is that what everybody should do, right? Should no one put into CRM? Should no one pre-plan, and then we'd have sales? Well, probably not, but right now we don't have the behavior to look at to see what leads to those personalized results. And then finally, we want to measure those results, but we don't want to measure them one time. Most training measurements, as Kent talked about before, not only are they kind of butts and seats kind of things, but really they're snapshots in time. They're not continually measuring performance. And if we think about almost every other process in an organization, we try to continually measure the performance, right? We continually measure accounts payable. We continually measure accounts receivable. In manufacturing, we're constantly measuring and evaluating the quality of the product. So is there a way that we can measure and evaluate the quality of the learning or the level of confidence or engagement over time rather than all at once? So before we go into some more information and really kind of reveal how we went about this process, I wanted to ask you a question about assessing your programs, and was wondering, how often do you currently review your training and take a look at the data to measure the efficacy of your programs? So are you looking at it, after 1 month? Do you look at it after 2 months? Do you do it and never look at it? And remember, this is anonymous, so it's true, you can write never.
That'd be a bad answer, but it's still anonymous.
Right. It's still anonymous.
And I think, Carl, for me, the key to this question is how often you look at the data to assess the program, not to necessarily make sure that people are completing items, which I think happens potentially more frequently. This is really about, when are you looking at the data for assessing program efficacy?
Right. Yes, why you're looking at it is very important. And this is also not to look at the data to say, yeah, where is everybody, or how's everybody doing? It's really, okay, is the program getting the results that we are looking for, that we expect from the program? Because that's really where you kind of can tie it all together.
So how are the responses looking, Tim?
Yeah, we're getting good responses, Tim?
We certainly are, everybody. Thanks so much for voting. I'm going to go ahead and close off the poll at this point. Everybody, thanks again for sharing. And Carl and Kent, I'm going to show you some fairly depressing results.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Everybody,
so,
thanks for sharing.
Right, yeah, we appreciate that. And it is anonymous, so you're all safe. So the data, though, is not surprising, unfortunately. It's very seldom that folks look at data to assess really what is the efficacy, what's really happening, what's the quality of that. And so that was also something that was underlying our philosophy of how to put this behaviorally based, personalized training program in place. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll be able to take a look and talk a little bit about what we did there. So we want a different approach to personalized learning, as I indicated. So what we did was we said, look, let's do a pre-assessment. So that's not that different than some of the things, but let's tie pre-assessment to confidence, engagement, and knowledge. And then throughout the process, let's ask periodic questions. So not after a month or 2 months, but let's look at it almost real time. How often can we ping the sales rep to find out if they have the knowledge? And one of the resistances to this is, sales rep doesn't want to answer a 20-page questionnaire every day. And I can't agree more. You really need to cut that down. But by asking smaller, targeted questions more frequently, we can get a better pulse, and you can be sure that the answer is more accurate and more thoughtful. So for example, if you're taking a 40-question assessment, your answer on question 39 is probably not approached with as much enthusiasm as maybe question number 2. So setting that right expectation to say, look, we're going to assess you on a more frequent basis, but we're not going to assess you with tons of questions. And that's what I was talking about, writing questions that match knowledge, engagement, and confidence, and using 1 or 2 questions to get to all 3 of those, or very simple questions. Get on a Likert type scale, what is your confidence level, and then using some back-end tools to find out if that tracks to rubrics and tracks to other behaviors. So we put together kind of a plan. Here's a general one. All of them are different, but we do a behavioral pre-assessment, kind of what do you do and when, and what are the expected results. And then we do a little bit of training, and then we check that on a regular basis. And by checking that on a regular basis, we can check the pulse of the learning. So lots of times we wait to the end of a learning event to find out if the learning event was effective. In this particular process, we're not going to wait to the end of the learning event. We're going to check in on progress throughout the whole learning process and treat learning as not an event, but as an ongoing relationship between the learner and the content, or really the learner and the outcomes that we're hoping to achieve. So in this particular case, we're able to track the effectiveness and base that effectiveness of the learning against the behavioral criteria that we set at the beginning of the process. So I think from my perspective, it's kind of exciting to be able to get that kind of real-time data and to see what's happening. So the deliverables of this process, if you're thinking, okay, well, how would I implement this, or what would I do? So first, of course, is a deployment strategy. So how am I going to take a look at what I have to provide to the sales reps or district managers or whoever it happens to be, and how do I then parse the questions, the type of questions throughout the organization? Then the next step, or kind of in process with that, is creating the confidence and engagement questions that get to behaviors that the sales reps are doing. And so you can do that several ways. There are banks of questions that look at confidence. You can look at some of the research about confidence. You can see what your most confident sales reps do and what kind of behaviors do they exhibit. So the secret here is not to try to capture every behavior that you think they do, but what are those predictive behaviors, as I said before, the on-base percentage behaviors that can help with success. And then we can't ignore knowledge, right? So knowledge is definitely part of a personal learning plan. I may pick up knowledge faster than you may pick up knowledge, or you may pick it up twice as faster than I pick up knowledge. So that's okay though, but what are those assessments? And then can we say, okay, looks like Carl's pretty much got this at the declarative knowledge, the basic states. Does he know how to apply it? Let's ask him some questions this week about application of the content, see if he can, certainly he can regurgitate it, but can he apply it? And the neat thing is, we know from research on distributed practice and spaced retrieval, doing a little bit over time from a retention perspective is much, much better than cramming the information and the data. In fact, it's interesting to me, there's over 100 years of studies that show learning a little bit of content over time is so much better than learning a lot of content all at once. Yet, before we had technology that we have today, it was really hard to fly all the sales reps in for 15 minutes of instruction, fly them all home, and then next week fly them all in again. You can't do that. But with the technology that we have now, we can. And the other advantage is this gives us regular findings, right? So now you have a real-time pulse of where the learners are in terms of the behaviors and the outcomes that you're looking for. And this real-time pulse allows you to make real-time changes and adaptations if the reps aren't getting it or if they're getting it faster than what you anticipated. So what does that really kind of look like in an implementation? So I'm going to talk to you about a new hire and kind of what the new hire looks like, but then Kent's going to talk about doing it one for more seasoned sales reps and kind of what the event there. So here you can see part one, we have this knowledge assessment. So we want to know where is the learner, what's happening in terms of the learner's knowledge. And then a little while later, in this case, 2 to 11 days after that, we're actually looking at knowledge check calls, right? So we could have a high touch, we can call them, we could survey them, you can do different things. In this particular place, we're reaching out to them and doing a little bit of a on-call discussion. And then we have an exam. So now let's test that. And when we say exam, we're not talking 50 questions exam. We're talking very short exam. And then you may have a few days in between and then go to part two and some more information there. And then maybe there's a certification process. And then maybe they go on some customer visits. And then we ask some more questions. And then maybe there's a live training. So you can see this training is a process that unfolds over time with frequent touch points of where the individual happens to be from a learning perspective. So here we can see these icons showing us different things. So we might have a knowledge check, kind of the brain thing. We might have a confidence check with thumbs up. We might have engagement with the conversation. So you can see that we lay this assessment over time on top of the new hire training process, which is also unfolding over time as it typically does. And then we're getting a real-time pulse of where the learner happens to be. So this gives us that data to find outliers, both negative outliers, they're not getting it, they're not confident, they're not engaged, and the wells, the people that, wow, this person is getting it really quickly, I think they could go in the field sooner because they're really, maybe it's past experience or maybe it's past knowledge or whatever, but wow, they've got that, they're ready to go. And it's kind of exciting because it allows the personalization of what used to be a lockstep process. And I always say that we took the worst of online instructor-led training. I'm sorry, we took the worst of classroom training, we put it online, right? Broadcast the same content to the same people, the same pace all the time, but we know people learn differently, we know they process information differently, but how do we assess that? And so this process gives us the tools to go ahead and do that assessment, which I think is really kind of interesting.
Hey, Carl, just to chime in there,
sure.
What's so interesting about that new hire scenario for us, if everyone looks at that first screen, that's not an atypical training journey and not one that I think we would look at and say there's any gross errors or there's any challenges instructionally that jump out immediately. I mean, people would have varying opinions on that. But as we started to assess how they were already measuring learners, it was over 1,300 questions that were available in this new hire journey, and over 99% of them were knowledge comprehension questions. So going back to, yes, you have to generate data. It can be a lot of data, but it has to be the right data. When we go to then overlaying some of the behavioral measurements, that's when you start to see a progression where knowledge and the right knowledge is applying to the expected or the desired behaviors that make a rep effective. And that's why if we think about, as you mentioned, spatial learning, and we talk a lot within our engagements about applying concepts like the AGES model, it's not just spacing knowledge, but this concept that we start to talk about spatial learning with the right behavioral measurements. And to your point, it doesn't have to be a lot. It just has to be the right questions at the right time. So a very subtle change, and it's really an overlay, not necessarily a complete reconstruction of the journey overall, but ensuring that we're implementing those right types of questions.
Right, exactly, yeah. It's having the right data and the right information to make a difference, and I think this process allows us to drill down into that right information. So now, as we talk about that, talking about frequently polling learners and finding out where they are, a question for the group is, how frequently do you believe that learners can be tested without creating survey fatigue? So this will give you an opportunity to kind of answer those questions as well. And so I'll give you a few minutes to indicate what you think. What are the elements, or what is the frequency that would cause fatigue? We've all, definitely survey fatigue is real. We've all experienced survey fatigue, and it's kind of interesting now that we have the tools to see what people feel about how often is being surveyed enough, how often is too much, and where is the difference between, a 100-page test, but then,
right,
one question every hour or something like that. So there's got to be something in between.
Right, because as we talk about enhancing the training journey for the sake of personalization, generating the right data in real time, there's no question that there is a suggestion here that we are essentially asking some more and different types of questions that we might have in the past. So Tim, it'll be interesting to see, what people think about survey fatigue as we're saying, hey, we believe that you can create better tools for personalization by asking questions a little bit more often.
Right.
Well, thanks, guys. We do have some results coming in. Everybody, thank you again for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here. And Kent and Carl, here's the results.
Okay, so interesting. So daily was not
definitely not daily.
Not daily, and I would have to agree. Getting a little thing daily is probably not a good idea. Although there was some really interesting research done on men in India who were glucose intolerant, and half they gave the traditional diabetes training, classroom type stuff. Half they sent them a text message twice a day that was behavioral, such as take the steps instead of the elevator, or don't eat while you're watching TV. And they reduced the incidences of type 2 diabetes by 36%. So those messages were, after time, even given on a daily basis, highly effective for changing behavior. But daily might be a little bit too much. 3 times a week might even be a little bit too much. But once per week seems about almost half the population said, yeah, that's not too bad. Now, you also have to think that these are not the 10-page quizzes, right? These are 1 or 2 highly targeted questions, and they allow both the sales rep, because it was interesting, sometimes what people don't like about learning is they don't really know where they are. So this isn't just helping the organization, but it's helping the individual learner. Like, did I really get this? Do I really understand it? Well, I won't know until I'm quizzed on it, or I take the assessment, or I learn. But this allows you to, over time, check more frequently on your understanding, which it turns out helps to build confidence. You're like, yeah, I know this, or helps to have people kind of study a little bit more. Yeah, I don't know this, but next time I get asked this question, I think I'm going to nail it because I'm going to do some studying. So let's go back to the slides and take a look at the idea of another personalized learning approach that's in action. Again, I did one that was a little bit more onboarding, new sales rep approach, and Kent's going to talk about one with a little bit more tenured people and has some statistics and data behind what the results were. I think you'll find it pretty interesting. Kent?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. And I think that's a great point, which is we talked a little bit about measuring behaviors. We've talked about spacing those measurement tools in an appropriate and consistent methodology. Ideally, it should apply where the behaviors that we believe indicate good performance should be true for a new rep or a tenured rep. They just might manifest themselves differently in the data. And that's definitely shown itself in this case study where not a new hire training scenario, but instead a 2-day training is really focused on refreshing knowledge in that tenured sales force and looking at some specific ideas around recall for product and disease state. But really, we started to look at and attach these behaviors, the critical behaviors, confidence and engagement, in a way that we thought would help us identify and remediate areas specific to some actions. So Carl talked a lot about when we define confidence and engagement, it has to be just, not just about are you confident and saying, yes, I feel like I can go out and get it. I have a firm handshake, but what are the specific actions and areas of knowledge applied by a confident rep out in the field? We were able to see in this situation, we're going to show the data in a second, that training, improved knowledge and retention of information, but we could also see a very discernible change, positive delta, sometimes a little bit negative delta as well, in the behaviors and specifically attaching those behaviors to actions. So take a look here. This is a learner population that we could carve a few different ways, and that's a critical piece as well. When you're looking at a personalized learning journey, you have to understand you may have a learner population that's 500 sales reps, for example, who are out in the field, but not all of those journeys, not all of those learning paths are going to be the same. You have to potentially look at them by regions or districts or teams, whatever the structure of your sales force is. It's important to potentially see and read the data on that level as well, and that's what we've done here. So this was a subgroup of 6 reps where you can see very straightforward numbers. Pre-assessment, we had an average confidence rating, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means, of 68, and a post-training rating of 81, and this is on a scale of 100. So in its own right, that says, great, people are more confident based on training now than they were before this journey started. Again, a 2-day meeting with some home study, a little bit of pre-training, and then some pull-through as well. But when we specifically dive into it, what does that mean? Well, we can see that there are some outliers, and that in its own right may be interesting. But what we were looking at was attaching these behavioral measures or confidence to the actions that a confident rep would take. And if you look at that conclusion area, the idea that the level of confidence in addressing concerns around competitive products, performing pre-call planning, addressing clinical concerns. These are actions, as Dr. Kopp mentioned, where a confident rep, we have seen in some of our conversations and our research and data that we've collected, would actually be applying knowledge areas beyond comprehension more effectively out in the field. So interesting that we can look at each of the reps within this subgroup very independently, and then we can also start to dive into the questions. If we even go back to the beginning and how this translates to personalization, it wasn't just a pre-survey and a post-survey. We had actually, by looking at the data real time and attaching specific actions that we expected to come out of a confident rep to questions, very granular questions or some observational work, we saw that this may be an issue, that knowledge around competitive products and the ability to apply competitive landscape or competitive product knowledge was something that this tenured force in these particular, this part of the group, had trouble with. This question, the one that was specifically around the competitive products, was earmarked right away. It had the lowest overall confidence score. We were able then to make a recommendation and work with this customer to say, that is an area where your curriculum may be light on training. You have additional either topics or modules or training assets that focus on competitive products. They are not necessarily as heavily weighted as some of the other areas like clinical concerns. this is potentially a place where you should consider personalizing the training journey for this subgroup of reps. Change the structure of the curriculum, change a little bit around the learning objectives that you're trying to achieve with that group, and the outcomes were somewhat dramatic, where we could see that the overall change in confidence around this topic was far and away the highest. We saw positive change as well around confidence in terms of articulating value benefits or thinking through very specific sales actions like pre-call planning. But the competitive product change, because it was an area that we saw really ripe for intervention, we're able to make a recommendation, change the distribution of training assets, and see a very measurable change that we know has had an effect in conversation with this customer, with reps out in the field. Carl, this jumps out at you, it has to, in terms of realizing some of the things that we hoped behavioral measurement would achieve.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is kind of exciting to look at the process as it unfolds, and you can see where the needs were and how the needs could be addressed before waiting for the end, before waiting till they're out in the field, before waiting too long. You could actually, and did actually, address these issues well before they became real issues. And all of this was related to the behavioral measures that were defined up front. So that work up front, defining confidence in this particular case related to competitive products, really paid off in terms of where the focus needed to go and then where the resources could go to help the reps position what they were doing more effectively, because we knew up front that there was an issue that needed to be addressed, or not up front, but through the process that there was an issue that needed to be addressed. So yeah, I think it's very exciting to see this kind of unfold.
And overall, there was a change in other behaviors as well. Something that we've considered and talked about and we didn't get into in this presentation is motivation. That's a topic for a different day, but an area that we would consider measuring in some circumstances. Confidence and engagement, clearly the ones that we focused on. Motivation is potentially a little control against some other things. But generally, the behaviors changed, they improved. For us, the key, though, in the real finding of this outcome was that structure, that methodology, and the ability to have that real-time data with the opportunity to intervene as a way that we can take tools that have been at our disposal for many years, reframe the types of things we're measuring, i.e. the behaviors that we've talked about over the last hour, and really have an opportunity to personalize the training journey so that the impact of reps and the way they act in the field can be much more effective. So before we take questions, and I know, Tim, we're running out of time, I just wanted to say thank you. Obviously, we still have a hashtag LTEN Learning. ClearPoint Learning, for those of you that have been on these webinars before, we've been in the industry for quite some time, 15 years in business now. We're a global organization who is entirely focused on building better sales teams for the life sciences industry. Certainly, if you're interested in learning more, we'd be happy to chat. Carl, I think your reputation at LTEN goes without saying. Certainly feel free to tell people about yourselves. Otherwise, Tim, we can jump into some questions with a few minutes we have left.
Yeah, no, I'm good. Let's jump into some questions.
Well, thank you very much. Great presentation, guys. Let me point out before I jump into a couple of questions. Oops, went too far. Both Carl and Kent have shared their contact information here, so if you have any additional follow-up questions, you're certainly welcome to reach out to them. We're not going to get to all the questions we had today, but if you have any questions, keep sending them in. Any questions we don't get to, we'll address offline for you as well. Kent and Carl, let me start with this really good question from Peggy. How do you overcome the reluctance to measure by managers where negative results could impact their jobs and evaluation time? That's a great question.
That is a great question. I mean, it's a difficult thing to answer, but what I sometimes say is, look, if you know this data ahead of time, you can make course corrections. If you don't have this information, you can't make a course correction, and then all of a sudden the results aren't there. It's kind of like working on a project with someone, and you keep saying, how's the project going? Oh, it's good, it's good, it's good, it's good. And then the night before they go, oh my gosh, I don't have anything done. Can you help me? and this is what we run into, right? We run into waiting to the last minute, things don't work out, and then we're scrambling or figuring out. Here, when you collect the data earlier, it gives you much more time to course correct than if you wait to the end. So I would say it actually sell it to the management as, look, here's a tool that you can use early on to make corrections so that the outcome is what you want it to be, rather than waiting for the big kind of reveal that's not positive. I don't know, Kent, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's right, Carl. Really, we're talking about delta, right? So instead of waiting till the end, as your point was made, that you may have bad outcomes, instead, with this methodology, this approach, the burden becomes ensuring that you have the ability to manage to a positive delta, and that's really the key here.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask a question from Carrie, and this goes back to our second poll about evaluating training. Is the reason never was the top choice for evaluating training because there isn't a specific role to actually look at the data, or because the mechanism to collect the data doesn't exist?
I think it's a little bit of both, but
both, yeah.
But everyone should be, you know, if you're in a training role, you should be looking at data to assess the effectiveness of what you're doing. So you know, in some organizations it is a separate role, but I would argue that if you're doing anything with training and you really want, if you're not just checking off the boxes, but you really want to make a difference in behavior, then you have to monitor. It's like any other process in the organization. If we want to make sure that our R&D process to create new solutions, new pharmaceuticals, we have to make sure that we measure that. It's ongoing. We tweak it if it's not working. We try it again. We run clinical trials. I mean, that whole process of scientifically thinking about the process of creating pharmaceuticals needs to be the same when we think about training, and doesn't always have to be a separate role. This is what I think. Yep.
That's a great answer. Yep.
Great, thank you. Folks, we are a little over time. I'm going to go ahead and take a couple of more questions, but if you do have to check out, we certainly understand and we apologize, but we are going to take a couple more questions. If you can stay with us, that's great. If not, you can also connect to the recording and hear whatever questions you might have missed. And again, if we didn't get to your question, we'll try to answer it offline as well. I also wanted to just remind you, as you lead today, please do look for that follow-up survey, and we're going to email you about an hour or so from now with a link to the recording for the interview who are looking for that as well. And I also wanted to tell you very quickly, I'll go back to the questions here, some upcoming webinars, and I'll show you some of these again later. I want to make sure I point out that on April 8th, Dr. Carl Kopp is back again with us talking about games and gamification and the quest for interactive learning. You can register for that webinar with Carl right now at l-10.org/webinars. And again, I'll come back to this information here momentarily. Let me take a couple more questions, Kent and Carl, if you have another few minutes with us.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. Kristen is asking, how do you measure engagement? I know that's a big question.
Right.
Yeah,
so,
Carl,
go ahead,
I
Ken.
can both address this. Now,
yeah.
This is back to what he referenced earlier without getting too much into the weeds, which is as we started to realize through customer interviews, discussions, experiential data points that engagement and confidence were critical behaviors, it was first about very clearly defining them through some of the journal research that Carl referenced, and then also going back out to our stakeholders and talking about, if this is the definition, what are the actions that an engaged rep takes? And let's very clearly identify what those actions are, and then using those different tools to really talk about actions, not about how people feel. So are you doing the following things with a certain level of frequency? Carl, jump in and talk a little bit about how we structured those questions, but that was really how the process started to proceed in building these standard questions for the program.
So one of the things that we did, we went to the literature and found out that a 7-point Likert type or Likert type scale is way too confining. So we actually have a scale that's 0 to 100, because then you're going to get more variance in the reporting. But if we want to look at engagement, we ask certain things of the managers, for example. And let me just throw out, hopefully without giving away secret sauce, let's throwing out a couple of examples. So we asked, for instance, on a daily basis, how often do you speak positively about your work environment? On a daily basis, how often do you go into your sales system? How much time do you commit on a daily basis expanding your knowledge about products, disease state, or competitor on your own? We also asked, if you're confronted with a difficult task, what do you do? But then we also looked at, okay, you have the system where sales folks report certain things in the system. Well, there's certain things in there that you think are related to engagement. Do they type in an after-call review? Do they go and seek out information independently? Do they take courses that aren't required? So we looked at those type of things. Now, we don't know the on-base percentage, as I said before, so we're going to look at several things that we think are predictive of certain behavior, and then we're going to say, yeah, this is predictive, or no, this is not predictive. So it's not as important, I don't think, to immediately hit the magic crystal that's going to predict future sales success, but just starting to look at the process will give you insights into how behaviors influence outcomes. And just having those insights, we've been in meetings where literally just breaking down engagement into behavioral measures for a particular organization led to learning insights. Like, we asked for engagement, but we never teach them how to do this. Why not? So I think that's the process that works in there. So I would say don't look for the number, don't look for that magic gem of measuring engagement. Look for how behaviors of successful sales reps you think lead to their success.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to ask just two more questions. Again, folks, I do apologize if we did not get to yours. A question from Cindy. Cindy's asking, beyond the LMS, what platform is used to collect all the data?
Ken, I think
it could be a number of different platforms. Yeah, certainly, we at ClearPoint have a training delivery platform that has onboard question and answer capabilities called Focal Point. And frankly, one of the primary reasons that platform, which is built to manage users through a training journey with home study and event-based training, has its own question and answer platform, is so we can collect this level of question data at a user to question level. It's critical that if you're delivering a training program, you can harvest that granular level of data. There are other systems. Some of the LMSs have very strong question answer engines, others not as much. There are standalone tools that have been on the market for quite some time, such as Question Mark and Pedagogue, that people tend to use. It's really all about understanding the ability to generate and report on the data. Frankly, we've even delivered some types of surveys using things like SurveyMonkey just to do a little bit of a diagnostic. So there are a number of tools that can be used. The key is to make sure you can get that granularity.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And let me make this the last question. Folks, again, thanks for hanging with us and for some great questions today. A question from Jeff. Carl, this is directed to you. Jeff says, nice methodology. Have you published any of your work? And are there any journals where we can see your study? I know you've published work.
Right, I have published work, but not on this right now. It's so new right now that we're working on it. And, an N of 6 is good, but it's not publishable. So we are looking for, actually, we're looking for clients who want to partner with us so we can publish the data. So we are right now working on putting this together in a publishable package, but we're not there yet.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, folks, we are quite a bit over, and I want to thank everybody for hanging with us today, and appreciate all your great questions and whatnot. And Carl and Kent, excellent presentations. Thank you both very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Tim.
I'm just going to end with a couple of quick reminders for folks. If you aren't already registered for the 45th LTEN Annual Conference, it's taking place June 13th to 16th at the Gaylord National in National Harbor, Maryland, just outside D.C. We would love to see you there. Certainly, it's not too late to register, so you can find out more information at LTENconference.com. And again, we've got some great, you can see some of the over 70 workshops, 10 learning tracks, a new learning track, lots of good stuff happening at the conference, and we certainly hope to see you there this year. And speaking of that, I wanted to end with invitation to join us for our next webinars. We'll be back next Friday, a week from this Friday, talking about branding the training department. We have a member benefits webinar, tell you a little bit more about LTEN on Wednesday, March 30th. And as mentioned before, on Friday, April 8th, Dr. Carl Kopp is back with us again, talking about games, gamification, and the quest for interactive learning. You can register for all of these and other webinars right now at l-10.org/webinars. For those looking for today's recording, again, we're going to send you an email connecting you to that in about 1 hour. But you can also find them shortly at l-10.org/webinar archives, along with our other archives webinars. And finally, my information again here at the bottom of the screen. If I can help you with anything around these webinars, please don't hesitate to reach out. With all that said, I'm going to send a final thank you to our speakers today, Count Melmrose and Dr. Carl Kopp. Thank you both very much. Also going to thank our sponsors today, ClearPoint Learning. We appreciate the chance to work with ClearPoint. We'll also be back doing other webinars this year with ClearPoint, so stay tuned for information on those. And mostly I'm going to thank all of you for your time, attention, participation, and patience on today's webinars. We ran a little bit over, but in a good way. We had some great content, and we appreciate your questions and your involvement. Look forward to seeing you here at the next at the next LTEN webinar. In the meantime, let me wish you all a good rest of your day, a good rest of your week, and we will talk to you all soon. Bye-bye, everybody.